My name is Hannah Caldwell, and I am 29 years old. Sometimes the quietest rooms hold the loudest truths, and I learned that the hard way during what was supposed to be a simple family trip to a rented house tucked into a mountain valley in Western Virginia. We had planned the week as a chance to slow down, breathe the cooler air, and maybe reconnect after months of me pouring everything into a big work project that finally brought some stability. I arrived a day early to get the place ready, thinking the extra time would let me set out fresh linens and stock the kitchen before everyone else showed up. My husband had gone into town for groceries, and the house sat still around me, the kind of stillness that usually feels peaceful until it doesn't. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters when his tablet lit up on the island with a string of message notifications. He had left it there after checking directions earlier, and without really thinking I glanced over, expecting a delivery update or something ordinary. Instead, the screen showed an open thread between him and my younger sister. The messages went back several days, and the words hit me one after another like stones dropped into still water. My husband had written that my new project was getting blown out of proportion and that Hannah always makes her work sound bigger than it is so people will feel sorry for how hard she works. My younger sister had replied almost immediately, saying the family should play it down at the trip because if we act excited she'll just use it as another reason to stay distant and stressed. They went back and forth about how best to keep things calm and how I'd turn everything into drama when people try to celebrate me. There were even suggestions about what to tell our parents so they wouldn't make a fuss over the small milestone I had been quietly proud of. The ground under me shifted in that moment. I stood there with the cloth still in my hand, reading the same lines twice because part of me kept hoping they would rearrange into something less deliberate. This wasn't a careless comment or a joke that landed wrong. This was a quiet, steady campaign to downplay. The one thing I had built for myself after years of carrying the heavier load. I had taken on extra freelance work when my husband's hours got cut last year. I had covered more of the bills without making it a fight. I had said yes to the family trip even though the timing pulled me away from wrapping up the project details that mattered to my future. None of that showed up in their thread. What showed up instead was a shared story that painted me as the unstable one, the one who needed managing so the rest of the family could have peace. If you have ever found words that were never meant for your eyes and realized the people you trusted most were rewriting your life while you were busy living it, then you know how the air can go thin in a single breath. I hope you will stay with me while I tell you what happened next, because that thread was only the beginning of the chaos that unfolded over the days we were supposed to spend together in that mountain valley house. I put the tablet face down and walked out onto the back deck, the valley spread out below in layers of green and shadow. My hands were shaking even though the rest of me felt strangely still, the way a lake looks calm right before a storm rolls in from the ridges. I kept replaying the messages, trying to find any other way to read them. Maybe they were worried about me. Maybe they thought they were helping. But the tone was too casual, too practiced, like this was not the first time they had traded notes on how to handle me. The reputation damage was already happening in private, and they planned to carry it into the open once the rest of the family arrived. I thought about the sacrifices I had made without complaint, the times I had swallowed my own exhaustion so everyone else could have what they needed. Those choices had not bought the loyalty I once believed they would. They had bought this instead. When my husband came back with the groceries, I was still on the deck. He carried the bags inside and called out that the roads were clear and the weather looked good for the week. I followed him into the kitchen and asked, as evenly as I could manage, why he and my younger sister were telling people my project was not worth celebrating. He set a carton of milk on the counter and gave me the kind of smile people use when they want you to feel unreasonable. He said I was reading too much into a private conversation and that he and my younger sister had only been trying to protect me from the family turning the trip into a work celebration I did not need right now. His voice stayed light, almost amused, but his eyes stayed flat. He told me I had been on edge for months and that everyone was just trying to keep things from spiraling the way they always did when I got focused on something new. The argument that followed did not stay light for long. I asked him why protecting me looked like agreeing I was dramatic and selfish. He said I was twisting his words again and that this was exactly why he and my younger sister felt they had to be careful about what they shared with the rest of the family. Every time I brought up the extra hours I had worked or the money I had moved around so we could afford the rental, he countered that I was keeping score and that love was not supposed to be a ledger. The words came faster, overlapping, his voice rising when I would not back down. He told me I was making the trip about me before it had even started and that my younger sister was right to worry I would pull away if people made too big a deal out of my small win. I felt the chaos rising between us, the same instability that had been hiding under the surface of our marriage for longer than I wanted to admit. He ended up slamming a cabinet door and saying we could talk when I was ready to be reasonable, then walked out onto the same deck I had stood on earlier. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time after that. The house that had felt like a fresh start now held the weight of every unsaid thing we had carried into it. I opened drawers looking for a notepad to make a grocery list I no longer cared about, and in the back of one of the lower cabinets I found a folded piece of paper that had clearly been there for years. It was a letter, the kind written on plain stationery with careful handwriting. The date at the top was from more than a decade ago, and the words were from my mother to someone else in the family. She wrote that I had always been intense about my schoolwork and that it was probably best not to make too much of my achievements because I tended to get ideas about what I deserved afterward. The letter went on to say that keeping praise measured had always been the kindest way to handle me. I read it twice, the paper soft at the creases from being opened and refolded many times. This was not new. The pattern of downplaying what I built had roots that went back long before my husband and my younger sister started their private thread. The forgotten letter in the drawer simply made the present betrayal feel less like an accident and more like the continuation of something older and more deliberate. I folded the letter and put it back where I had found it. Outside, the light was starting to change across the valley, the shadows lengthening between the ridges. My husband had not come back inside yet. My phone stayed silent on the counter. I knew that once the rest of the family arrived, the neighborhood gathering my husband had mentioned planning with some of the locals would happen, and I wondered how many of them had already heard the version of me that my husband and my younger sister had been circulating. The trip had barely begun and the ground was already cracking under the version of our life I had tried so hard to hold steady. I did not know yet how much further it would break, or what choosing myself would actually cost when the week was over. But the messages and the letter had made one thing clear: the sacrifices I had made had not protected me from the quiet work of rewriting who I was. They had only given the people closest to me more material to use against the parts of me that refused to stay small. The rest of that first evening settled into a heavy, uneven quiet after my husband came back inside from the deck. We moved around each other in the rental house without speaking much, the valley outside turning dark between the ridges while the lights in the kitchen felt too bright. I kept the folded letter in the drawer where I had found it, but the words from it stayed with me, mixing with the messages I had read on the tablet. By the time we went to bed, the house already felt different, like the walls had absorbed the argument and were holding it for the rest of the week. The next morning my mother and father arrived first, pulling up in their old sedan with the familiar sound of gravel under the tires. My husband went out to help with their bags, his voice easy and warm as he greeted them. I stayed on the porch for a moment longer, watching how naturally he slipped back into the role of the steady son-in-law. When I joined them inside, my mother hugged me and said the drive had been beautiful, that the mountains always made her feel like she could finally breathe. My father asked about the project I had mentioned in passing weeks ago, but before I could answer, my husband cut in lightly, saying it was coming along and that we were trying to keep the trip focused on rest instead of work talk. The comment landed softly, but I felt the shift. It was the same downplaying language from the thread, now offered in front of my parents as if it were simple consideration. My younger sister showed up a few hours later with Brian Tate, the family friend who had driven her up from the valley town. Brian had known our family for years through church events and occasional holiday gatherings, the kind of steady presence who always offered to help carry things or fix a loose step. He greeted everyone with his usual easy smile and asked if the house had enough firewood for the cooler nights. My younger sister hugged me quickly and then turned to my husband with a look that passed between them, quick and practiced. I caught it and felt the ground tilt again. The campaign was not just in messages anymore. It was in the way they moved around me, the way they filled the spaces with ordinary talk that left me standing slightly outside the circle. By afternoon, the plan for the neighborhood gathering had been set. One of the families who lived farther down the valley road had offered their large back porch and yard for a casual meet and greet with a few other locals and anyone staying in the rental houses nearby. It was meant to be low-key, the kind of thing my husband had suggested would help everyone relax. We walked over together as a group, the path winding through trees that smelled of pine and damp earth. My mother chatted with my younger sister about the garden she wanted to plant when they got home. My father walked ahead with Brian, talking about the fishing spots in the area. My husband stayed close to my side but kept his hands in his pockets, his voice low when he spoke to me at all. The gathering itself started out ordinary enough. People introduced themselves, passed around plates of food someone had brought from town, and stood in small clusters with views of the valley opening up below. I stayed near the edge of the porch at first, listening more than talking. After a while, one of the neighbors asked my husband what had brought our family up for the week. He answered easily that we were celebrating a quiet stretch after a busy season, then added that I had wrapped up a work thing recently but we were both ready to unplug. The neighbor nodded and said something polite about how nice it was to have projects finish well. My husband smiled and said, "It's nothing huge, but it's good she got it done so we can all enjoy the time here without extra stress hanging over us." The words were mild, almost kind on the surface. But I heard the same thread running through them. He was downplaying it again, this time in public, framing my success as something that had been an inconvenience to the family's peace. I felt the heat rise in my chest before I could stop it. I stepped closer and said, clearly enough for the small group to hear, that the project had actually been a big step forward after months of extra work on top of everything else at home. My husband's smile stayed in place, but his eyes flicked to my younger sister for half a second before he answered. He said I had a habit of making things sound bigger than they felt in the moment and that the whole point of the trip was to step away from that kind of pressure. My younger sister laughed lightly and added that I had always been the one in the family who turned small wins into big stories. The neighbor looked between us, clearly unsure how to respond. Brian Tate, who had been standing a few feet away, shifted his weight and changed the subject to the weather, but the moment had already cracked open. The rest of the gathering moved around the tension like water around a stone. People kept talking, plates kept passing, but I could feel the eyes on me whenever I spoke. My mother tried to smooth things over by asking about the hiking trails nearby. My father stayed quiet, watching. My husband stayed close enough to hear everything I said but far enough that it looked natural. My younger sister stayed glued to his side, filling silences with easy chatter that kept pulling attention away from me. By the time we started walking back to the rental house, the sky had turned the color of old tin and the air had cooled fast. No one mentioned the exchange on the porch, but the silence between us felt louder than the argument the night before. Back at the house, my husband went straight to the kitchen to start dinner. My parents settled in the living room with a deck of cards. My younger sister went out to the deck with her phone. I stayed in the hallway for a moment, the weight of the day pressing down. Brian Tate had offered to help with the firewood and was stacking it near the side door when his phone chimed. He glanced at it, frowned, and then looked up at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to apology in the same breath. He said he had meant to forward a photo of the valley view to his wife but had hit the wrong thread by mistake. Before he could stop it, the message had gone out to a small group that included me. The screenshot that appeared on my phone a minute later was from a private chat between my husband and my younger sister that had continued after the tablet messages I had already seen. In it they discussed how to handle me if I pushed back during the trip. My husband had written that I was getting that look again and that the best way to keep my parents from taking my side was to keep reminding everyone that I tended to blow things up when I don't get the attention I want. My younger sister had agreed and added that she would make sure our mother knew I had been difficult about the gathering so no one would be surprised if I acted off for the rest of the week. The messages were time-stamped from that afternoon, right before we had walked over to the neighbor's porch. They had planned the downplaying in real time. I stood there in the hallway with the phone in my hand while Brian apologized again and said he had already texted the group to ignore the mistake. The words on the screen did not rearrange no matter how long I stared. This was not worry. This was strategy. My husband and my younger sister were not just protecting some version of peace. They were actively shaping how the rest of the family saw me so that any pushback I made would look like instability instead of a boundary. The neighborhood gathering had been one more stage for the same performance, and now the evidence of it had landed in my hands by accident. I walked into the kitchen where my husband was stirring something on the stove. The smell of onions and garlic filled the room, ordinary and warm. I held up the phone without raising my voice and asked him to explain why he and my younger sister were still texting about how to manage me after the gathering had already happened. He turned, spatula still in his hand, and the look on his face moved from surprise to the same flat calm he had used the night before. He said Brian had clearly forwarded something out of context and that I was doing exactly what they had been worried about, turning a simple mix-up into another reason to make the trip about my feelings. My younger sister appeared in the doorway a moment later, phone in her hand, and said the same thing in almost the same words. The two of them stood there together, voices steady, while the chaos I felt inside started to show on the edges of everything. My mother called from the living room asking if anyone wanted tea. My father's voice followed, asking about the cards. Outside the window the valley had gone fully dark, the lights from the distant houses small and scattered. I looked at my husband and my younger sister and realized the pattern had never been about protecting me. It had been about keeping me small enough that my success, my boundaries, and my voice would not disrupt the story they preferred to tell about our family. The letter in the drawer had shown it was older than this week. The forwarded screenshot showed it was still happening in real time. And the gathering had shown that they were willing to let it spill into public spaces if it kept the control in their hands. I set the phone down on the counter between us. The house that had been meant for rest now held the full weight of what had been hidden in plain sight. My husband asked if I was going to ruin the rest of the evening over a forwarded message. My younger sister said nothing, but her eyes stayed on me with the same steady calculation I had seen in the thread. I did not answer them right away. The decision forming in the back of my mind was still quiet, still forming, but it was already changing the air in the room. I knew that whatever came next would not be the peaceful family trip any of us had pictured when we first planned the drive into these mountains. The ground had shifted too far for that. And I was no longer willing to pretend I could carry everyone else's version of me without breaking under the weight of it. The kitchen lights felt too sharp against the dark windows as I stood there with the phone still glowing on the counter between us. My husband set the spatula down slowly, the onions still sizzling behind him. He asked again if I was really going to turn the entire week into another one of my dramas over a message that had clearly been taken out of context. My younger sister stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, her voice steady when she finally spoke. She said the forwarded screenshot was exactly the kind of thing that proved how quick I was to assume the worst about the people trying to look out for me. The words landed with the same calm calculation I had seen in every message and every sideways glance since we arrived in these mountains. My mother came into the kitchen then, asking what was wrong, her voice already carrying the worry that had lived in our family for years. My father followed a moment later, still holding the deck of cards. I picked up the phone and showed them the screenshot Brian had accidentally sent. I did not raise my voice. I simply read the lines out loud, the ones where my husband and my younger sister had planned how to frame me at the gathering so that any pushback would look like instability. The room went quiet except for the sound of the onions starting to burn. My mother read the words twice, her face changing as she connected them to the letter she had written years ago, the one I had found in the drawer, the one that had used almost the same language about keeping me from getting ideas about what I deserved. My husband tried to steer it back. He said the messages were just him and my younger sister venting because I had been difficult lately and that showing them to my parents was only going to make everything worse. He told me I was the one who had been sacrificing the family's peace by turning every small thing into a battle. The entitlement in his voice was no longer hidden. He said I had always expected everyone to rearrange their lives around whatever I was building at work, and that the least I could do was let the rest of them have 1 week without walking on eggshells. My younger sister nodded and added that if I kept pushing, the whole family would end up fractured over something that had never been that serious to begin with. The chaos in the room was no longer just between the three of us. It had pulled my parents into the center of it, and I could see the old pattern trying to reassert itself, the one where my success was always reframed as selfishness and my boundaries were always called drama. I told them the truth I had been carrying since I read the first thread on the tablet. I had paid for most of the rental and the groceries and the gas for the drive because my husband's hours had been cut again. I had rearranged client calls and stayed up late finishing work so I could be present for the trip without anyone feeling neglected. I had done those things because I still believed that showing up and carrying the weight would eventually buy the kind of loyalty that did not require me to shrink. The forwarded messages and the old letter proved that belief had been a purchase I could never afford. My husband's face hardened. He said keeping score was exactly why our marriage had become so exhausting and that if I was going to throw every sacrifice in his face then maybe the problem was not the messages at all. My younger sister told my mother that this was what she had been worried about, that I would find a way to make the week about my need to be right instead of just letting everyone rest. The argument circled and escalated in the way arguments do when the ground underneath them has already given way. My father tried to calm things by suggesting we all sit down, but my husband kept talking over him, his voice rising now, accusing me of ambushing the family with a forwarded mistake and of never being satisfied no matter how much everyone tried to accommodate me. My younger sister backed every point, her words landing like reinforcements. I felt the hidden pain I had carried for years rise to the surface, not as chaos but as a clear, steady line I could finally see. The sacrifices had never been about love. They had been about trying to purchase a version of family that would only exist if I stayed small enough to fit inside the story they preferred to tell. Later that night, after the kitchen had emptied and the burned onions had been scraped into the trash, my phone lit up with a message from Aunt Vivian Holt. She was my father's older sister, the one who lived 2 states away and only came to big gatherings. She had received the same accidental forward Brian had sent, and she had gone through her own old emails looking for something she remembered from years before. The message she forwarded to me was a chain from more than 8 years ago. In it my husband, who had just started dating me at the time, had written to my younger sister about how I was already making everything about my career and how the family should probably start getting used to downplaying my achievements so I would not expect special treatment forever. My younger sister had replied that she would help keep things in perspective. The chain continued across several years, the same language appearing whenever I hit a milestone at work or took on extra responsibility at home. Aunt Vivian wrote only one line with the screenshots: "This has been going on longer than any of us wanted to see. I am sorry it took an accident for it to reach you." The confirming evidence from my distant relative landed like the final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling in the dark. The campaign had never been a reaction to my recent project. It had been a standing agreement between my husband and my younger sister, supported by older patterns in the family, to keep me from ever believing my own success belonged to me. The neighborhood gathering had simply been the latest stage. The sacrifices I had made had funded the very dynamic that required me to stay quiet about them. The next morning I packed my bag while the rest of the house was still quiet. My husband stood in the bedroom doorway and asked if I was really going to leave in the middle of the trip and make everyone else deal with the fallout. I told him I was not leaving to punish anyone. I was leaving because I would not keep purchasing a place at the table by agreeing to be smaller than I am. He said I was throwing away years over messages that meant nothing and that the family would never be the same after this. I answered that the family had already changed the moment he and my younger sister decided my reality was something that needed managing. My younger sister appeared behind him, quiet for once, and I saw in her face that the natural consequences were already beginning. The story they had built together was no longer private. It had been seen by my parents and by Aunt Vivian and by Brian, and the version of me they had worked so hard to create was cracking under the weight of the actual words. I drove out of the mountain valley that morning with the windows down, the cool air moving through the car as the ridges fell away behind me. The loss arrived in quiet waves over the following weeks. The casual family get-togethers that had once been automatic, the holiday calls, the quick texts about weekend plans, the easy assumption that we would all show up for one another without question, those things did not survive the trip. My mother tried a few times, but the conversations stayed careful and short. My father sent one message saying he wished things had gone differently. My younger sister did not reach out. My husband sent a single text weeks later asking if I was really going to let 1 week destroy everything we had built. I did not answer it. The answer had already been given in the way I had packed my bag and driven away from the version of love that had required me to keep paying for it with pieces of myself. What I gained in the space that opened after I stopped trying to purchase loyalty was something quieter and harder to name at first. I stopped arranging my schedule around the fear of being called dramatic. I stopped explaining my work successes as if they needed permission to exist. I started making decisions about my time and my money and my energy without running them through the old filter of whether they would upset the careful balance my husband and my younger sister had maintained. The freedom did not feel triumphant. It felt like air after holding your breath for too long. Some nights the loss of the easy family connections still sat heavy in the room with me, but it no longer came with the requirement that I shrink to make room for it. I learned that you cannot purchase love through sacrifice when the people receiving the sacrifice have already decided your success is a threat instead of a shared win. The only real option left was to choose myself before the cost became my entire life. The messages, the gathering, the letter in the drawer, and the confirming evidence from my aunt had all pointed to the same truth. The story they had written about me had never been about protecting the family. It had been about protecting a version of the family that could only exist if I stayed the person who carried everything and complained about nothing. Once I stopped agreeing to that role, the gatherings and the easy calls and the automatic inclusion stopped on their own. The natural consequences had unfolded without me needing to force them. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If this story found you in a season where you are still trying to buy peace by carrying more than your share, I hope it gives you permission to set the weight down. Type boundaries if this resonated.